Tonight's lecture is over the ecology of living things. In your study of biology so far, you have learned about the diversity of life on Earth and about the molecular and cellular structures and processes that make life tick. Ecology, the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environments, offers a different perspective of life, biology from the skin out, so to speak. Humans have always had an interest in other organisms and their environments. As hunters and gatherers, prehistoric people had to learn where and when game and edible plants could be found in the greatest abundance. Naturalists, from Aristotle to Darwin and beyond, made the process of observing and describing organisms in their natural habitats an end in itself rather than simply a means of survival. Extraordinary insight can still be gained from the discovery-based approach of watching nature and recording its structure and processes. As you might expect, field research, whether discovery-based natural history or hypothesis-driven science, is fundamental to ecology. But ecologists also test hypotheses using laboratory experiments where conditions can be simplified and controlled. And some ecologists take a theoretical approach, devising mathematical and computer models which enable them to simulate large-scale experiments that are impossible to conduct in the field. Moving on, organismal ecology is concerned with the evolutionary adaptations that enable individual organisms to meet the challenges posed by their abiotic environments. The distribution of organisms is limited by the abiotic conditions they can tolerate. For example, amphibians such as the salamander, in general, are restricted to moist environments because their skin does not prevent dehydration. In fact, it plays a significant role in the exchange of gases with the environment. You'll encounter other examples of organismal ecology throughout this chapter. The next level of organization in ecology is the population, a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular geographic area. Population ecology concentrates mainly on factors that affect population density and growth. A community consists of all the organisms that inhabit a particular area. So in other words, a community is an assemblage of populations of different species. Questions in community ecology focus on how interactions between species such as predation and competition affect community structure and organization. An ecosystem includes all the abiotic factors in addition to the community of species in a certain area. For example, a savanna ecosystem includes not only the organisms such as diverse plants and animals, but also the soil, water sources, sunlight, and other abiotic factors of the environment. In ecosystem ecology, questions concern energy flow and the cycling of chemicals among various biotic and abiotic factors. The biosphere is the global ecosystem, the sum of all the planet's ecosystems, or all life and where it lives. The most complex level in ecology, the biosphere includes the atmosphere to an altitude of several kilometers, the land down to water-bearing rocks about 1,500 meters deep, lakes and streams, caves, and the oceans to a depth of several kilometers. Moving on, isolated in space, the biosphere is self-contained or closed, except that its photosynthetic producers derive energy from sunlight and it loses heat to space. Many different factors can potentially affect an organism's interaction with the environment. Biotic factors, which are all of the organisms in the area that make up the living component of the environment. Other organisms may compete with an individual for food or for other resources, prey upon it, or change its physical and chemical environment. On the other hand, abiotic factors make up the environment's non-living component and include chemical and physical factors such as temperature, light, water, minerals, and air. An organism's habitat is the specific environment it lives in. This includes the biotic and abiotic factors of its surroundings. When we study the interactions between organisms and their environments, it is convenient to divide ecology into four increasingly comprehensive levels. That is, organismal level, population level, community level, and the ecosystem level. So, moving on, ecology can be classified based on the primary kinds of organisms under study, the biomes principally studied, the geographic or climatic area, the spatial scale under consideration, the philosophical approach, and the methods used. Moving on, biogeography is the study of the geographic distribution of living things and the abiotic factors that affect their distribution. Ecologists who study biogeography examine patterns of species distribution. No species exists everywhere. For example, the Venus flytrap is endemic to a small area in North and South Carolina. An endemic species is one which is naturally found in only a specific geographic area that is usually restricted in size. Other species are what we call generalists. These are species which live in a wide variety of geographic areas. The raccoon, for example, is native to most of North and Central America. Moving on, energy from the sun is captured by green plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and photosynthetic protists. These organisms convert solar energy into chemical energy that is needed by all living things. Light availability can be an important force directly affecting the evolution of adaptations in photosynthesizers. For instance, plants in the understory of a temperate forest are shaded when trees above them in the canopy completely leaf out in the late spring. So, to no surprise, understory plants have adaptations to successfully capture the available light. One such adaptation is the rapid growth of spring ephemeral plants such as the spring beauty, which is pictured on your slide. However, in many aquatic environments, light cannot penetrate beyond certain depths. As a result, most photosynthesis in a body of water occurs near the surface. Surprisingly, life also thrives in environments that are completely dark. A mile or more below the ocean's surface lies the unique world of hydrothermal vents. These are sites near the adjoining edges of giant plates of the Earth's crust where molten rock and hot gases surge upwards from the Earth's interior. Towering chimneys, sometimes as high as 30 meters, emit scalding water and hot gases. These are ecosystems powered by chemoautotrophic bacteria that derive energy from the oxidation of inorganic chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide. Bacteria with similar metabolic talents support communities of cave-dwelling organisms. Moving on, the availability of nutrients in aquatic systems is also an important aspect of energy or photosynthesis. Many organisms sink to the bottom of the ocean when they die in the open water. When this occurs, the energy found in that living organism is sequestered for some time unless ocean upwelling occurs. Ocean upwelling is the rise of deep ocean waters that occurs when the prevailing winds blow along the surface waters near a coastline. As the wind pushes ocean waters offshore, the water from the bottom of the ocean moves up to replace this water. As a result, the nutrients once contained in dead organisms become available for reuse by other living organisms. Moving on, in freshwater systems, the recycling of nutrients occurs in response to air temperature changes. The nutrients at the bottom of lakes are recycled twice each year, in the spring and fall turnover. The spring and fall turnover is a seasonal process that recycles nutrients and oxygen from the bottom of a freshwater ecosystem to the top of a body of water. These turnovers are caused by the formation of a thermocline, that is, a layer of water with a temperature that is significantly different from that of the surrounding layers. In wintertime, the surface of lakes found in many northern regions is frozen. However, the water under the ice is slightly warmer, and the water at the bottom of the lake is warmer yet. Water is densest at 4 degrees Celsius, therefore, the deepest water is also the densest. The deepest water is oxygen poor because the decomposition of organic material at the bottom of the lake uses up available oxygen that cannot be replaced by means of oxygen diffusion into the water due to the surface ice layer. Moving on, temperature is an important abiotic factor because of its effect on metabolism. Few organisms can maintain sufficiently active metabolisms at temperatures close to 0 degrees Celsius and temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius. These temperatures destroy the enzymes of most organisms. Still, extraordinary adaptations enable some species to live outside this temperature range. For example, bacteria and archaea living in hot springs have enzymes that function optimally at extremely high temperatures. At other extremes, communities consisting of bacteria, algae, and small invertebrates inhabit sea ice at both poles of the Earth. Moving on, temperature, moisture, soil nutrients, and light are important influences on plant production, that is, their primary productivity and the amount of organic matter that is available as food, the net primary productivity. In terrestrial environments, net primary productivity is estimated by measuring the above-ground biomass per unit area, which is the total mass of living plants excluding the roots. Moving on, water is essential to all life. For terrestrial organisms, the primary threat is drying out in the air. Many land species have watertight coverings that reduce water loss. A waxy coating on the leaves and other aerial parts of most plants helps prevent dehydration. Aquatic organisms are surrounded by water, but they face problems of water balance if their own solute concentration does not match that of their surroundings. The distribution and abundance of photosynthetic organisms, including plants, algae, and photosynthetic bacteria, depend on the availability of inorganic nutrients such as compounds of nitrogen and phosphorus. Plants obtain these nutrients from the soil. Soil structure, pH, and nutrient content often play major roles in determining the distribution of plants. In many aquatic ecosystems, low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus limit the growth of algae and photosynthetic bacteria. Several abiotic factors are important in aquatic but not terrestrial ecosystems. While terrestrial organisms have a plentiful supply of oxygen from the air, aquatic organisms must depend on oxygen dissolved in water. This is a critical factor for many species of fish. Cold, fast-moving water has a higher oxygen content than warm, stagnant water. Salinity, or saltiness, currents, and tides also play a role in many aquatic ecosystems. To that end, some abiotic factors affect terrestrial but not aquatic ecosystems. For example, wind is often an important abiotic factor on land. Wind increases an organism's rate of water loss by evaporation. The resulting increase in evaporate cooling can be advantageous on a hot summer day, but it can cause dangerous wind chill in the winter. In some ecosystems, frequent occurrences of natural disturbances such as storms or fire play a role in the distribution of organisms. The ability of organisms to live in the Earth's diverse environments demonstrates the close relationship between the fields of ecology and evolutionary biology. Darwin was an ecologist, although he predated the word ecology. It was the geographic distribution of organisms and their exquisite adaptations to specific environments that provided Darwin with evidence for evolution. Evolutionary adaptation via natural selection results from the interactions of organisms with their environments, which brings us back to our definition of ecology. Thus, events that occur in the short term during the course of an individual's lifetime may translate into effects over the longer scale of evolutionary time. For example, because the availability of water affects the plant's growth and ultimately its reproductive success, precipitation has had an impact on the gene pool of a plant population. After the period of below-average rainfall, drought-resistant individuals may become more prevalent in a plant population. The abiotic factors in a habitat may vary from year to year, seasonally, or over the course of a day. An individual's abilities to adjust to environmental changes that occur during its lifetime are themselves adaptations refined by natural selection. For instance, if you see a bird on a cold day, it may look unusually fluffy. Small muscles in the skin raise the bird's feathers. This is a physiological response that traps the insulating pockets of air. Some species of birds adjust to seasonal cold by growing heavier feathers, and some bird species respond to the onset of cold weather by migrating to warmer regions. This is a behavioral response. Note that the responses occur during the lifetime of an individual, so they do not qualify as evolution, which is a change in a population over time. Like birds, mammals can create a temporary layer of insulation on cold days by contracting skin muscles, in this case attached to hairs. Our own muscles do this too, but we just get goosebumps instead of a furry insulation. The blood vessels in the skin also contract, which slows the loss of body heat. In both cases, the adjustment occurs in just seconds. A gradual, though still reversible, physiological adjustment that occurs in response to an environmental change is called acclimation. For example, suppose you move to Boston, which is essentially at sea level, to the mile-high city of Denver. One physiological response to the lower oxygen supply in your new environment would be a gradual increase in the number of your red blood cells which transport oxygen from your lungs to the other parts of your body. Acclimation can take days or weeks. This is why high-altitude climbers, such as those attempting to scale Mount Everest, need extended stays at high-elevation base camp before proceeding to the summit. The ability to acclimate is generally related to the range of environmental conditions a species naturally experiences. Species that live in very warm climates, for example, usually cannot acclimate to extreme cold. Among vertebrates, birds and mammals can generally tolerate the greatest temperature extremes because, as endotherms, they use their metabolism to regulate internal temperature. In contrast, ectothermic reptiles, such as snakes, tolerate a more limited range of temperatures. Furthermore, many organisms respond to environmental change with some type of change in body shape or structure. When the change is reversible, the response is an example of acclimation. Many mammals, for example, grow heavier coats of fur in response to cold, and then they shed it in the summer when it gets warm. Sometimes fur or feather color changes seasonally as well. This helps to camouflage the animal against the winter snow and the summer vegetation. Other anatomical changes are irreversible over the lifetime of an individual. Environmental variation can affect the growth and development so much that there may be remarkable differences in body shape within a population. In general, plants are more anatomically changeable than animals. Rooted and unable to move to a better location, plants rely entirely on their anatomical and physiological responses to survive environmental fluctuations. In contrast to plants, most animals can respond to an unfavorable change in the environment by moving to a new location. Such movement may be fairly localized. For example, many desert ectotherms, including reptiles, maintain a reasonably constant body temperature by shuttling between sun and shade. Some animals are capable of migrating great distances in response to such environmental cues as the changing seasons. Many migratory birds overwinter in Central and South America, returning to the northern latitudes to breed during the summer. And humans, with their large brains and available technology, have an especially rich range of behavioral responses to the environment. One example would be dressing for winter. When it gets cold out, humans will put on a winter coat. That is an example of a behavioral response to the environment. Moving on, the abiotic factors you learned about in the previous section are largely responsible for the distribution of life on Earth. Using various combinations of these factors, ecologists have categorized the Earth's environments into biomes. A biome is a major terrestrial or aquatic life zone characterized by vegetation type in terrestrial biomes or the physical environment in aquatic biomes. In this section, we'll briefly survey the Earth's biomes. Terrestrial ecosystems are grouped into biomes primarily on the basis of their vegetation type. By providing food, shelter, nesting sites, and much of the organic material for the decomposers that recycle mineral nutrients, plants build the foundation of the communities of animals and other organisms typical of each biome. The geographic distribution of plants and thus of biomes largely depends on the climate, with temperature and rainfall often key factors in determining the kind of biome that exists in a particular region. If the climate in two geographically separate areas is similar, the same type of biome may occur for both. Coniferous forests, for instance, extend in a broad band across North America, Europe, and Asia. There is local variation within each biome, giving the vegetation a patchy rather than uniform appearance. For example, in northern coniferous forests, snowfall may break branches and small trees, causing openings where broadleaf trees such as aspen and birch can grow. Local storms and fires also create openings in many biomes. Each biome is characterized by a type of biological community rather than an assemblage of a particular species. For example, the groups of species living in the deserts of southwestern North America and in the Sahara Desert of Africa are different, but both groups are adapted to desert conditions. Organisms in widely separated biomes may look alike because of convergent evolution, that is, the appearance of similar traits in independently evolved species living in similar environments. And this map on our slide is a map of the major terrestrial biomes. Although this map has sharp boundaries, biomes actually grade into one another. Tropical forests occur in equatorial areas where the temperature is warm and days are 11 to 12 hours long year-round. The type of vegetation is determined primarily by rainfall. Tropical rainforests, like the one in our picture, may receive 200 to 400 centimeters, that's 79 to 157 inches of rain per year. The layered structure of tropical rainforests provides many different habitats. Treetops form a closed canopy over one or two layers of smaller trees and a shrub understory. Few plants grow in the deep shade of the forest floor. Many trees are covered by woody vines growing toward the light. Other plants, such as orchids, gain access to sunlight by growing on the branches or trunks of tall trees. Scattered trees reach full sunlight by towering above the canopy. Many animals also dwell in trees where food is abundant. Monkeys, birds, insects, snakes, bats, and frogs find food and shelter many meters above the ground. Rainfall may be less plentiful in other tropical forests. Tropical dry forests predominate in lowland areas that have a prolonged dry season or scarce rainfall at any time. The plants found there are a mixture of thorny shrubs and trees and succulents. In regions with distinct wet and dry seasons, tropical deciduous trees are common. Savannas, such as the one shown in the picture, are dominated by grasses and scattered trees. The temperature is warm year-round. Rainfall averages 30 to 50 centimeters, that's roughly 12 to 20 inches per year, with dramatic seasonal variation. Fire caused by lightning or human activity is an important abiotic factor in the savanna. The grasses survive burning because growing points on their shoots are below ground. Other plants have seeds that sprout rapidly after a fire. Poor soil and lack of moisture, along with fire and grazing animals, prevent the establishment of most trees. The luxuriant growth of grasses and small broadleaf plants during the rainy season provides a rich food source for plant-eating animals. Many of the world's large grazing mammals and their predators inhabit the savannas. African savannas are home to zebras and many species of antelope, as well as to lions and cheetahs. Several species of kangaroo are dominant grazers of the Australian savannas. Oddly, though, the large grazers are not the dominant plant eaters in the savannas. That distinction belongs to insects, especially ants and termites. Other animals include burrowers such as mice, moles, gophers, and ground squirrels. Deserts are the driest of all biomes, characterized by low and unpredicted rainfall that is less than 30 centimeters or about 12 inches per year. Some deserts are very hot, with daytime soil surface temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit and large daily temperature fluctuations. Other deserts, such as those west of the Rocky Mountains and the Gobi Desert spanning northern China and southern Mongolia, are relatively cold. Air temperatures in cold deserts may fall below -30 degrees Celsius or -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Desert vegetation typically includes water-storing plants such as cacti and deeply rooted shrubs. Various snakes, lizards, and seed-eating rodents are common inhabitants. Arthropods, such as scorpions and insects, also thrive in the desert. Evolutionary adaptations of desert plants and animals include a remarkable array of mechanisms that conserve water. For example, the pleated stem of the saguaro cacti enables the plants to expand when they absorb water during wet periods. Some desert mice never drink, deriving all their water from the metabolic breakdown of the seeds they eat. Protective adaptations that deter feeding by mammals and insects, such as spines on cacti and poisons in the leaves of shrubs, are common in desert plants. The climate that supports chaparral vegetation results mainly from cool ocean currents circulating offshore, producing mild, rainy winters and hot, dry summers. As a result, this biome is limited to small coastal areas, some in California. The largest region of chaparral surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, Mediterranean is another name for this biome. Dense, spiny, evergreen shrubs dominate chaparral. Annual plants are also common during the wet winter and spring months. Animals characteristic of the chaparral are deer, fruit-eating birds, seed-eating rodents, and lizards and snakes. Chaparral vegetation is adapted to periodic fires caused by lightning. Many plants contain flammable chemicals and burn fiercely, especially where dead brush has accumulated. After a fire, shrubs use food reserves stored in the surviving roots to support rapid shoot regeneration. Some chaparral plants produce seeds that will germinate only after a hot fire. The ashes of burned vegetation fertilize the soil with mineral nutrients, promoting regrowth of the plant community. Houses do not fare as well. The firestorms that race through the densely populated canyons of Southern California can be devastating to human inhabitants. Temperate grasslands have some of the characteristics of tropical savannas, but they are mostly treeless, except along rivers or streams, and are found in regions of relatively cold winter temperatures. Rainfall, averaging between 25 and 75 centimeters per year, which is approximately 10 to 30 inches, with frequent severe droughts, is too low to support forest growth. Periodic fires and grazing by large mammals also prevent invasion by woody plants. These grazers include the bison and the pronghorn in North America, the wild horses and sheep of the Asian steppes, and kangaroos in Australia. As in the savanna, however, the dominant plant eaters are invertebrates, especially grasshoppers and soil-dwelling nematodes. Without trees, many birds nest on the ground. Many small mammals such as rabbits, voles, ground squirrels, prairie dogs, and pocket gophers dig burrows to escape predators. Temperate grasslands, like the one shown in your picture, once covered much of north central America. Because grassland soil is both deep and rich in nutrients, these habitats provide fertile land for agriculture. Most grassland in the United States has been converted to cropland or pasture, and very little natural prairie exists today. Temperate broadleaf forests occur throughout middle latitudes where there is sufficient moisture to support the growth of large trees. Annual precipitation is relatively high, ranging from 75 to 150 centimeters or 30 to 60 inches per year, and typically is distributed evenly around the year. The annual temperature varies over a wide range with hot summers and cold winters. In the northern hemisphere, dense deciduous trees are trademarks of temperate forests, such as the one pictured on your slide. Deciduous trees drop their leaves before winter when temperatures are too low for effective photosynthesis, and water lost by evaporation is not easily replaced from the frozen soil. Numerous invertebrates live in the soil and the thick layer of leaf litter that accumulates on the forest floor. Some vertebrates, such as mice, shrews, ground squirrels, will burrow for shelter and food, while others, including many species of birds, live in the trees. Predators include bobcats, foxes, black bears, and mountain lions. Many mammals that inhabit these forests enter a dormant winter state called hibernation, and some bird species migrate to warmer climates. Virtually all the original temperate broadleaf forests in North America were destroyed by logging or cleared for agriculture or development. These forests tend to recover after disturbance, and today we see deciduous trees growing in undeveloped areas over much of their former range. Cone-bearing evergreen trees such as pine, spruce, fir, and hemlock dominate the boreal forest or the coniferous forest in the northern hemisphere. Other kinds of conifers grow in parts of South America, Africa, and Australia. The northern coniferous forest, or taiga, is the largest terrestrial biome on Earth. This stretches in a broad band across North America and Asia, south of the Arctic Circle. Taiga is also found at cool, high elevations in more temperate latitudes, for example, in much of the mountainous regions of western North America. The taiga is characterized by long, snowy winters and short, wet summers that are sometimes warm. The slow decomposition of conifer needles in the thin, acidic soil makes few nutrients available for plant growth. The conical shape of many conifers prevents too much snow from accumulating on their branches and breaking them. Animals of the taiga include mouse, elk, hares, bears, wolves, grouse, and migratory birds. The Asian taiga is home to the dwindling number of Siberian tigers that remain in the wild. The temperate rainforests of coastal North America from Alaska to Oregon are also coniferous forests. Warm, moist air from the Pacific Ocean supports this unique biome, which, like most coniferous forests, is dominated by a few tree species, typically hemlock, Douglas fir, and redwood. These forests are heavily logged, and the old-growth stands of trees rapidly are disappearing. Tundra covers expansive areas of the Arctic between the taiga and the polar ice. Permafrost, which is permanently frozen subsoil, bitterly cold temperatures, and high winds are responsible for the absence of trees and other tall plants in the Arctic tundra that is shown in your picture on the slide. The Arctic tundra receives very little annual precipitation. However, water cannot penetrate the underlying permafrost, so melted snow and ice accumulate in pools on the shallow topsoil during the short summer. Tundra vegetation includes small shrubs, grasses, mosses, and lichens. When summer arrives, annual plants grow quickly and flower in a rapid burst. Caribou, musk oxen, wolves, and small rodents called lemmings are among the mammals found in the Arctic tundra. Many migratory animals use the tundra as a summer breeding ground. During the brief but productive warm season, the marshy ground supports the aquatic larvae of insects, providing food for the migratory waterfowl, and clouds of mosquitoes often fill the tundra air. High winds and cold temperatures create plant communities called alpine tundra on very high mountaintops at all latitudes, including the tropics. Although these communities are similar to Arctic tundra, there is no permafrost beneath the alpine tundra. Moving on, gazing out over a vast ocean, you might think that it is the most uniform environment on Earth, but marine habitats can be as different as night and day. The deepest ocean, where hydrothermal vents are located, is perpetually dark. In contrast, the vivid coral reefs nearer the surface are utterly dependent on sunlight. Habitats near the shore are different from those in mid-ocean, and the seafloor hosts different communities than the open waters. The cartoon on this slide shows the marine biome zones. Moving on, the coral reef biome occurs in the photic zone of the warm tropical waters in scattered locations around the globe. A coral reef is built up slowly by successive generations of coral animals, a diverse group of cnidarians that secrete a hard external skeleton, and by multicellular algae encrusted with limestone. Unicellular algae live within the coral cells, providing the coral reef with food. The physical structure and the productivity of coral reefs support a huge variety of invertebrates and fishes. Moving on, freshwater biomes cover less than 1% of Earth, and they contain a mere 0.01% of its water, but they harbor a disproportionate share of biodiversity, an estimated 6% of all described species. Moreover, we depend on freshwater biomes for drinking water, crop irrigation, sanitation, and industry. Freshwater biomes fall into two broad groups: standing water, which includes lakes and ponds, and flowing water, such as rivers and streams. The difference in water movement results in a profound difference in ecosystem structure. Lakes and ponds are standing bodies of water that range from small ponds, only a few meters in area, to large lakes such as the North America's Great Lakes. The North American Great Lakes are thousands of square kilometers in area. In lakes and large ponds, the communities of plants and algae and animals are distributed according to the depth of water and its distance from shore. Shallow water near the upper layer of water away from the shore make up the photic zone, so named because of the light that is available for photosynthesis. Microscopic algae and cyanobacteria grow in the photic zone, joined by rooted plants and floating plants such as water lilies in the photic area near the shore. If a lake or pond is deep enough or murky enough, it has an aphotic zone where light levels are too low to support photosynthesis. At the bottom of all aquatic biomes is the benthic realm. This is made up of sand and organic and inorganic sediments. The benthic realm is occupied by communities of organisms that are collectively called benthos. If you have ever waded barefoot into a pond or lake, you have felt the benthos squish between your toes. Dead material that quote-unquote rains down from the productive surface waters of the photic zone is a major source of food for the benthos. The mineral nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, typically regulate the amount of phytoplankton growth in a lake or pond. Many lakes and ponds are affected by large inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus from sewage and runoff from fertilized lawns and farms. These nutrients often produce heavy growth of algae, which reduces light penetration. When the algae die and decompose, a pond or lake can suffer serious oxygen depletion, killing fish that are adapted to high oxygen conditions. Rivers and streams, which are bodies of flowing water, generally support quite different communities of organisms than lakes and ponds. A river or stream changes greatly between its source, which could be a spring or a snowmelt in the mountains, and the point at which it empties into a lake or the ocean. Near a source, the water is usually cold, low in nutrients, and clear. The channel is often narrow, with a swift current that does not allow much silt to accumulate on the bottom. The current also inhibits the growth of phytoplankton. Most of the organisms found here are supported by the photosynthesis of algae attached to rocks or by organic material such as leaves carried into the stream from the surrounding land. The most abundant benthic animals are usually insects that eat algae, leaves, or one another. Trout are often the predominant fishes, locating their food, including insects, mainly by sight in the clear water. Downstream, a river or stream typically widens and slows. There, the water is usually warmer and may be murkier because of the sediments and phytoplankton usually suspended in it. Worms and insects that burrow into mud are often abundant, as are waterfowl, frogs, and catfish, and other fishes that find food more by scent and taste than by sight. Many streams and rivers have been affected by pollution from human activities. We have also altered rivers by constructing dams used for flood control to provide reservoirs of drinking water or to generate hydroelectric power. In many cases, dams have completely changed the downstream ecosystems, altering the rate and volume of water flow and affecting the fish and invertebrate populations. A wetland is a transitional biome between an aquatic ecosystem and a terrestrial one. Freshwater wetlands include swamps, bogs, and marshes. Covered with water either permanently or periodically, wetlands support the growth of aquatic plants and are among the richest of biomes in terms of species diversity. They provide water storage areas that reduce flooding and improve water quality by trapping pollutants such as metals and organic compounds in their sediments. The recognition of their ecological and economic value has led the government and private efforts to protect and restore wetlands. Moving on, a transition area between a river and the ocean is called an estuary. The saltiness of estuaries ranges from nearly that of fresh water to that of the ocean. With their waters enriched by nutrients from the river, estuaries like freshwater wetlands are among the most productive areas on Earth. Oysters, crabs, and many fishes live in estuaries or reproduce in them. Estuaries are also crucial nesting and feeding areas for waterfowl. Mudflats and salt marshes are extensive coastal wetlands that often border estuaries. Moving on, ecologists generally define a population as a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same general area. Members of a population are likely to interact and breed with one another. They rely on the same resources and are influenced by the same environmental factors. Population ecology focuses on the factors that influence a population's density, that is, the number of individuals per unit area or volume, structure, that is, such as relative numbers of individuals of different ages, size, which is the number of individuals, and the growth rate, that is, the rate of change in a population size. Population ecology also plays a key role in applied research. For example, it provides critical information for identifying and saving endangered species. Population ecology is being used to develop sustainable fisheries throughout the world and to manage wildlife populations. Studying the population ecology of pests and pathogens provides insight into controlling how they spread. Population ecologists also study human population growth, one of the most critical environmental issues of our time. Let's consider what a snapshot of a population might look like. The first question is, which individuals are included in this population? A population's geographic boundaries may be natural, as with certain species of largemouth bass in an isolated lake, but ecologists often define a population's boundaries in more arbitrary ways that fit their research questions. For example, an ecologist studying the contribution of sexual reproduction to the population growth of sea anemones might define a population as all the anemones of one species in a particular tide pool. Another researcher studying the effects of hunting on deer might define a population as all the deer within a particular state. Yet another researcher attempting to determine which segment of the human population will be most affected by the AIDS epidemic might study the HIV infection rate of the human population in one nation or throughout the world. Moving on, our snapshot of a population would include population density, the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. For instance, the number of largemouth bass per cubic kilometer of a lake, or the number of oak trees per square kilometer in a forest, or the number of nematodes per cubic meter in the forest soil. In rare cases, an ecologist can actually count all of the individuals within the boundaries of the population. For example, we could count the total number of oak trees, say 200, in a forest covering 50 kilometers squared. the population density would be the total number of trees divided by the area, or 4 trees per square kilometer. Keep in mind that population density is not a constant number. It changes when individuals are born or die, and when new individuals enter the population by immigration or leave it, emigration. Moving on, territorial birds, such as penguins, tend to have a uniform population distribution. On the other hand, plants such as dandelions with wind-dispersed seeds tend to be more randomly distributed. And animals such as elephants that travel in groups exhibit a clumped distribution. Moving on, demography is the statistical study of population changes over time. This includes birth rates, death rates, and life expectancies. Life tables provide important information about the history of an organism. Moving on, life tables track survivorship. That is, the chance of an individual in a given population to survive to a various age. The life insurance industry uses life tables to predict how long, on average, a person of a given age will live. Ecologists represent life table data graphically in a survivorship curve, that is, a plot of the number of individuals still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. Moving on, by using a percentage scale instead of actual ages on the x-axis, we can compare species with widely varying lifespans on the same graph. The curve for the human population in blue shows that most people survive to the older age intervals. Ecologists refer to the shape of this curve as type 1 survivorship. Species that exhibit a type 1 curve, humans and many other large mammals, usually produce few offspring but give them good care, increasing the likelihood that they will survive to maturity. In contrast, a type 3 curve, which is in green on your slide, indicates a low survivorship for the very young, followed by a period when survivorship is high for those few individuals who live to a certain age. Species with this type of survivorship curve usually produce very large number of offsprings, but provide little or no care for them. Some species of fish, for example, produce millions of eggs at a time, but most of these offspring die as larvae from predation or other causes. Many invertebrates, such as oysters, also have a type 3 survivorship curve. A type 2 survivorship curve, which we see in red on our slide, is intermediate, with survivorship constant over the lifespan. That is, individuals are no more vulnerable at one stage of the life cycle than another. This type of survivorship has been observed in some invertebrates, lizards, and rodents. Moving on, a population's pattern of survivorship is a key feature of its life history, the set of traits that affect an organism's schedule of reproduction and survival. Let's take a closer look now at how natural selection affects the reproductive patterns that evolve in populations. Key life history traits include age at first reproduction, the frequency of reproduction, the number of offspring, and the amount of parental care given. For a given population in a particular environment, natural selection will favor the combination of life history traits that maximizes an individual's output of viable, fertile offspring. In other words, life history traits, like anatomical features, are shaped by evolutionary adaptation. Natural selection cannot maximize all life history traits simultaneously because an organism has limited time, energy, and nutrients. For example, an organism that gives birth to a large number of offspring will not be able to provide a great deal of parental care. Consequently, the combination of life history traits represents trade-offs that balance the demand of reproduction and survival. Because selection pressures vary, life histories are very diverse. Nevertheless, ecologists have observed some patterns that are useful for understanding how natural selection influences life history characteristics. One life history pattern is typified by small-bodied, short-lived animals, for example, insects and small rodents that develop and reach sexual maturity rapidly, have a large number of offspring, and offer little or no parental care. In plants, quote-unquote parental care can be measured by the amount of nutritional material stocked in each seed. Many small non-woody plants, like dandelions for example, produce thousands of tiny seeds. Such organisms have an opportunistic life history, one that enables the plant or animal to take immediate advantage of favorable conditions. In general populations with this life history pattern, they will exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve. In contrast, some organisms have an equilibrial life history, that is a pattern of developing and reaching sexual maturity slowly and producing few, well-cared-for offspring. Organisms that have an equilibrial life history are typically large-bodied, longer-lived species, for example, bears and elephants. Populations with this life history pattern exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve. Plants with a comparable life history trait include certain trees. For example, coconut palms produce relatively few seeds that are well stocked with nutrient-rich material. But what accounts for the differences in life history patterns? Some ecologists hypothesize that potential survival rate of the offspring and the likelihood that each adult will live to reproduce again are the critical factors. In a harsh, unpredictable environment where the adult may have just one good shot at reproduction, it may be an advantage to invest in quantity rather than quality. On the other hand, in an environment where favorable conditions are more dependable, an adult is more likely to survive to reproduce again. Seeds are more likely to fall on fertile ground, and newly emerged animals are more likely to survive to adulthood. In that case, it may be more advantageous for the adult to invest its energy in producing a few well-cared-for offspring at a time. Of course, there is much more diversity in life history patterns than just the two extremes that I described here. Nevertheless, the contrasting patterns are useful for understanding the interactions between life history traits and our next topic. Moving on, a species may reproduce once, we call that similarity, or many times, we call that heteroparity, in its life. The Chinook salmon mates once and dies. The pronghorn antelope mates during specific times of the year during its reproductive life. And primates such as humans and chimpanzees may mate on any day, independent of ovulation. Moving on, now that we have examined the regulation of population growth in other organisms, what about our own species? Let's begin by looking at the history of the human population and then consider some current and future trends in population growth. In the time it takes for me to say this sentence, approximately 26 babies will be born somewhere in the world and 10 people will die. An imbalance between births and deaths is the cause of population growth or decline, and as the line graph that we will see on the next slide shows, the human population is expected to continue increasing for at least the next several decades. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide so we can see the graph that I was talking about. In this graph, we can see at the year 1500, there was approximately 480 million people in the world. Today, there are nearly 9 billion people in the world. In the exponential population growth model, we assume that the rate of the population growth was constant. That is, births and deaths were roughly equal. As a result, population growth depended only on the size of the existing population. Throughout most of human history, this assumption held true. Although parents had many children, mortality was high. As a result, human population growth was initially very slow. The 1 billion mark was not reached until the early 1800s. As economic development in Europe and the United States led to advances in nutrition and sanitation and later medical care, humans took control of their population's growth rate. At first, the death rate decreased while the birth rate remained the same. the net rate of increase rose and the population growth began to pick up some steam by the beginning of the 1900s. By mid-century, improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare had spread to the developing world, spurring growth at a breakneck pace as birth rates far outstripped death rates. As the world population skyrocketed from 2 billion in 1927 to 3 billion just 33 years later, some scientists became alarmed. They feared that the Earth's carrying capacity would be reached and that density-dependent factors would maintain that population size through human suffering and death. But the overall growth rate peaked in 1962. In the more developed nations, advanced medical care continued to improve survivorship, but effective contraceptives held down the birth rate. As a result, the overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the difference between birth rate and death rate decreased. Because economic development has occurred at different times in different regions, worldwide population growth rates reflect a mosaic of the changes occurring in different countries. In the most developed nations, the overall growth rates are near zero. In the developing world, on the other hand, death rates have dropped, but high birth rates persist. As a result, these populations are growing rapidly. Of the over 82 million people added to the world each year, almost 80 million are in developing nations. Moving on, predation refers to an interaction in which one species, the predator, kills and eats another, the prey. Because predation has such a negative impact on the reproductive success of the prey, numerous adaptations for predator avoidance have evolved in prey populations through natural selection. For example, some prey species like the pronghorn antelope run fast enough to escape their predators. Others, like rabbits, flee into shelters. Still other prey species rely on mechanical defenses such as a porcupine's sharp quills or hard shells of clams and oysters. Adaptive coloration is a type of defense that has evolved in many species of animals. Camouflage, called cryptic coloration, makes potential prey difficult to spot against its background. Warning coloration, that is bright patterns of yellow, red, or orange in combination with black, often marks animals with defective chemical defenses. Predators learn to associate these color patterns with undesirable consequences such as noxious taste or a painful sting, and they will avoid the potential prey with similar markings. The vivid colors of the poison dart frog, an inhabitant of the Costa Rican rainforests, warn of noxious chemicals in the frog's skin. A prey species may also gain significant protection through mimicry, that is, a copycat adaptation in which one species looks like another. For example, the pattern of alternating red, yellow, and black rings of the harmless scarlet king snake resembles the bold color pattern of the venomous eastern coral snake. Some insects have combined protective coloration with adaptations of body structures in elaborate disguises. For instance, there are insects that resemble twigs, leaves, and bird droppings. Some even do a passable imitation of a vertebrate. For example, the colors on the dorsal side of the hawk moth caterpillar are effective camouflage, but when disturbed, the caterpillar flips over to reveal the snake-like eyelids of its ventral side. Eye spots that resemble vertebrate eyes are common in several groups of moths and butterflies. A flash of these large, quote-unquote, eyes startles would-be predators. In other species, an eye spot may deflect a predator's attack away from its vital body parts. Anyway, getting back to the graph on this slide, we see when the hare population increases, the hare is the prey, the lynx population on average also increases, and the lynx is the predator. And in this next slide, we just see some examples of some defenses that animals have developed. Moving on to the next slide, we see the use of camouflage in some animals. And on this slide, we see the aposematic coloration, as I was discussing on the previous slide. And here is an example of mimicry on this slide. Moving on, in the logistic model of population growth, increasing population density reduces the amount of resources available for each individual. Intraspecific, that is, within the species, competition for limited resources ultimately limits population growth. In interspecific competition, the population growth of a species may be limited by the population densities of competing species as well as by the density of its own population. What determines whether populations in a community compete with each other? Each species has an ecological niche that is defined as the sum of its use of the biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. For example, the ecological niche of a small bird called the Virginia's warbler includes its nest sites and nest building materials, the insects it eats, and the climatic conditions such as the amount of precipitation and the temperature and humidity that enable it to survive. In other words, the ecological niche encompasses everything the Virginia's warbler needs for its existence. The ecological niche of the orange-crowned warbler includes some of the same resources used by the Virginia's warbler. Thus, when these two species inhabit the same area, they are competitors. Ecologists investigated the effects of interspecific competition between populations of these two birds in a community in Arizona. When they removed either Virginia's warblers or the orange-crowned warblers from the study site, members of the remaining species were significantly more successful in raising their offspring. Thus, interspecific competition had a direct negative effect on reproductive fitness. If the ecological niches of two species are too similar, they cannot coexist in the same place. Ecologists call this the competitive exclusion principle, a concept introduced by Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss, who demonstrated this effect with an elegant series of experiments. Gauss used two closely related species of protists. One was Paramecium caudatum, and the other was Paramecium aurelia. First, he established the carrying capacity for each species separately under the conditions used to culture or grow them in the laboratory. Then he cultured the two species in the same habitat. Within 2 weeks, the Paramecium caudatum population had crashed. Gauss concluded that the requirements of these two species were so similar that the superior competitor, in this case Paramecium aurelia, depraved Paramecium caudatum of essential resources. Moving on, in symbiosis or mutualism, both species benefit from an interaction. For example, symbiotic root fungus associations called mycorrhizae are mutualistic. Mutualism can also occur between species that are not symbiotic, such as flowers and their pollinators. Coral reef ecosystems depend on mutualism between certain species of coral animals and unicellular algae. Reefs are constructed by successive generations of colonial corals that secrete an external calcium carbonate skeleton. The formation of the skeleton must outpace erosion and competition for space from fast-growing seaweeds. Massive coral reefs are made possible by the millions of algae that live in the cells of each coral polyp. In turn, the reef provides the food, shelter, and living space that support the splendid diversity of the reef community. The sugars that the algae produce by photosynthesis provide at least half of the energy used by the coral animals. In return, the algae gain a secure shelter that allows access to light. They also use the coral's waste products, including carbon dioxide and ammonia, which is a valuable source of nitrogen. Moving on, a commensal relationship occurs when one species benefits from the close, prolonged interaction while the other is neither benefited nor is harmed. An example of this is shown in the picture on your slide. A bird that builds a nest in a tree is benefiting from the tree's structure while it is not harming the tree. That is commensalism. Moving on, both plants and animals may be victimized by parasites or pathogens. These interactions are beneficial to one species, the parasite or pathogen, and harmful to the other, known as the host. A parasite lives on or in the host from which it obtains nourishment. Pathogens are disease-causing bacteria, viruses, fungi, or protists that can be thought of as microscopic parasites. External parasites include arthropods such as ticks, lice, mites, and mosquitoes, which attach to their victims temporarily to feed on blood or other body fluids. Plants are also attacked by parasites, including roundworms and aphids, tiny insects that tap into the phloem to suck the plant sap. In any parasite population, reproductive success is greatest for individuals that are best at locating and feeding on their hosts. For example, some aquatic leeches first locate a host by detecting movement in the water and then confirm its identity based on the host's body temperature and chemical cues on its skin. Non-native pathogens, whose impact can be rapid and dramatic, have provided some opportunities to investigate the effects of pathogens on communities. In one example, ecologists studied the consequences of the epidemic of the chestnut blight. The loss of chestnuts, massive canopy trees that once dominated many forest communities in North America, had a significant impact on community composition and structure. Trees, such as oaks and hickories that had formerly competed with chestnuts, became more numerous. Overall, the diversity of tree species increased. Dead chestnut trees also furnish niches for other organisms such as insects, cavity-nesting birds, and eventually decomposers. Moving on, foundation species are considered the base or bedrock of a community, having the greatest influence on its overall structure. They are usually the primary producers, that is, organisms that bring the most energy into the community. Foundation species may physically modify the environment to produce and maintain habitats that benefit the other organisms that use them. Moving on, the species diversity of a community, the variety of species that make up the community, has two components. The first component is species richness, or the number of different species in the community. The other component is the relative abundance of the different species, the proportional representation of a species in a community. Moving on. Although the abundance of dominant species, such as a forest tree, can have an impact on the diversity of other species in the community, a non-dominant species may also exert control over community composition. A keystone species is a species whose impact on its community is much larger than its total mass or abundance indicated. The term keystone species was derived from the wedge-shaped stone at the top of an arch that locks all the other pieces into place. If the keystone is removed, the arch collapses. A keystone species occupies an ecological niche that holds the rest of its community in place. To investigate the role of potential keystone species in a community, ecologists compare diversity when the species is present or absent. Experiments by Robert Payne in the 1960s were among the first to provide evidence of the keystone species effect. Payne manually removed a predator, a sea star of the genus Pisaster, from the experimental areas of the intertidal zone of the Washington coast. The result was Pisaster's main prey, a mussel, outcompeted many of the other shoreline organisms that included algae, barnacles, and snails. The mussel outcompeted these other organisms for the important resource of space on the rocks. The number of different organisms present in experimental areas dropped from more than 15 species to fewer than 5. Ecologists have identified other species that play a key role in the ecosystem structure. For instance, the decline of sea otters off the western coast of Alaska allowed populations of sea urchins, their main prey, to increase. The abundance of urchins, which consume seaweeds such as kelp, has resulted in the loss of many kelp forests and the diversity of marine life that they support. In many ecosystems, however, ecologists are just beginning to understand the complex relationship among species. The value of an individual species may not be apparent until it's gone. Moving on, an invasive species is a non-native species that has spread far beyond the original point of introduction and causes environmental or economic damage by colonizing and dominating suitable habitats. In the United States alone, there are hundreds of invasive species, including plants, mammals, birds, fishes, arthropods, and mollusks. Worldwide, there are thousands more. Regardless of where you live, an invasive plant or animal is probably living nearby. Invasive species are a leading cause of local extinctions. Plus, the economic costs of invasive species are numerous, an estimated $137 billion per year in the United States. Not every organism that is introduced into a new habitat is successful, and not every species that survives in a new habitat becomes invasive. There is no single explanation for why any non-native species turns into a destructive pest, but invasive species typically exhibit an opportunistic life history pattern. A female European rabbit, for example, can begin to breed at the age of 4 months and produce 5 or more litters of 4 or 5 offspring per year. The life history traits of cheatgrass, an invasive plant in the arid western United States, have enabled its spectacular success as well. Its seeds were accidentally carried into the United States with a grain from Asia and then spread by livestock. Currently, cheatgrass covers more than 60 million acres of rangeland that was formerly dominated by native grasses and sagebrush, and it claims an estimated 4,000 more acres every day. Cheatgrass seeds sprout during fall rains, and the roots continue to grow underground through the winter. Already established, when the warm spring weather arrives, dense clumps of cheatgrass deprive native species or crops of soil moisture and mineral nutrients. It also produces seeds easier and in greater abundance than its competitors. After cheatgrass seeds mature in early summer, the plants become extremely dry and flammable, creating abundant fuel that is easily ignited by lightning or a stray spark. Cheatgrass fires are more intense and occur more frequently than fires that native plants have evolved to tolerate. After a few fire cycles, the native plants are gone, robbing more than 150 species of birds and mammals of food and shelter they derive from the sagebrush. Many invasive animals also deprive native species of resources. For example, European starlings aggressively displaced woodpeckers, bluebirds, and swallows from their nesting sites, even pulling out nestlings to make room for their own offspring. These destructive birds were first released in New York in 1890. From the original introduction of 100 or so birds, it took just 50 years for starlings to spread throughout North America and reach an estimated population of over 200 million. Flocks numbering in the tens or hundreds of thousands devour grain and fruits from fields, feedlots, and orchards. In urban areas, the acidic droppings from dense starling populations are corrosive to buildings and foul-smelling as well. Moving on, communities change drastically following a severe disturbance that strips away vegetation and even soil. The disturbed area may be colonized by a variety of species which are gradually replaced by a succession of other species in a process called ecological succession. When ecological succession begins in a virtually lifeless area with no soil, it is called primary succession. Examples of such areas are cooled lava flows on volcanic islands and the rubble left by a retreating glacier. Often, the only life forms initially present are autotrophic bacteria. Lichens and mosses, which grow from wind-blown spores, are commonly the first multicellular photosynthesizers to colonize the area. Soil develops gradually as rocks weather and organic matter accumulates from the decomposed remains of the early colonizers. Lichens and mosses are eventually overgrown by grasses and shrubs that sprout from seeds blown in from nearby areas or carried in by animals. Finally, the area is colonized by plants that become the community's prevalent form of vegetation. Primary succession can take hundreds or thousands of years. Secondary succession occurs where a disturbance has destroyed an existing community but left the soil intact. For example, secondary succession occurs as areas recover from floods or fires. Disturbances that lead to secondary succession are also caused by human activities. Even before colonial times, humans were clearing the temperate deciduous forests of eastern North America for agriculture and settlements. Some of this land was later abandoned as the soil was depleted of its chemical nutrients or the residents moved west to new territories. Whenever human intervention stops, secondary succession begins. So we'll go ahead and recap tonight's lecture with a quick review. You should know what the scope of ecology is. You should know the difference between abiotic and biotic components of the environment. You should know what the different biomes are of our world. You should know the scope and the study of population ecology. And you should know the scope and study of community ecology.